Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. For recording purposes, I'm going to start with just speaking what this is so folks who watch it later will know. Today is April 10th, 2024. It is 10:30 a.m. and this is panel number 18033 titled Housing Not for All, and we'll be exploring homelessness crisis within the United States. Quickly just introduce myself and then we'll do some housekeeping and then I'll introduce the panelists. My name is Megan Newton. I work for the City of Boulder. I am the policy advisor on homelessness, which basically means I oversee a lot of the funding and the strategy around homelessness locally here in Boulder. Some of the housekeeping is I'd like to first read a land acknowledgement. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastating wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Now I'm going to go on to explain how we're going to do questions and answers. I'd like to mention that we want to be sure to get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from our producers, who are on both the back sides of the room. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. For more information on the panelists, you can find their full bios on the CWA website. So I'm going to start on this end and make my way down. On my far right is Asia Eaton. She is a feminist social psychologist and associate professor in psychology at Florida International University. Asia's research explores how gender intersects with identities such as race, sexual orientation, age, and class affect individual access and experience with social power in intimate partner relationships and in the workplace. She's received the Emerging Leadership Award from the Committee for Women in Psychology, SPSSI's Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award, and SPSSI's Michelle Alexander Early Career Award. She also serves as the head of research for Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is working to understand and end the emerging epidemic of non-consensual porn in the US. In addition to her academic endeavors, Asia has collaborated closely with leadership at the Lotus House, the largest US shelter serving women experiencing homelessness. This partnership has provided valuable insights into the unique needs and challenges faced by the women who've experienced homelessness. So that's Asia. And then next to me on my right is Yvonne Vissing. She's a professor at Salem State University, where she serves as the founding director of the Center for Childhood and Youth Studies in the Center for Human Rights. She holds the position of U.S. Policy Chair for the Hope for Children Convention at the Child Policy Center, and is actively involved with organizations such as Human Rights Educators USA and the Association for the Advancement of Science Human Rights Council. With a background in clinical sociology and extensive research experience, including postdoctoral research fellowships and a Whiting Foundation Fellowship, Yvonne has authored 20 books focusing on various aspects of children's rights, homelessness, and social justice. She has an extensive experience in advocacy, serving on boards and providing training and consultation services to organizations in areas such as mental health, child advocacy, and homelessness. She was also a long-term member of the National Coalition for the Homelessness Board. Thank you. And finally, to my left is Britta Fisher. She is the president and CEO of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. Britta previously was Denver's first chief housing officer and executive director of the Department of Housing Stability, growing funds from $20 million to $270 million in her 4 years in the Mayor Hancock's administration. Now, Britta leads the largest homelessness services provider in Colorado, serving more than 21,000 people with housing, healthcare, and supportive services. And now I'll start down with Asia on my right, and they're going to just do a brief 2 to 3 minute introduction themselves.
Thank you, Megan. Hi, everyone. My name is Asia. Oh, you can't hear me. What about now? Better? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Megan. My name is Asia. I'm a psychologist at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. And for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been my privilege to do research in collaboration with Lotus House Women's Shelter in Miami, Florida, to better understand women's experiences with homelessness, their needs and coping strategies, and find ways to better serve them. Lotus House Shelter is the largest shelter for women and children in the country, serving over 1,500 diverse women and youth each year. And it is a multifaceted, comprehensive, trauma-informed, supportive community that helps guests exit the shelter system successfully at least 80% of the time. And while I worked with Lotus House, one of the things that I learned is that wide-scale homelessness can be solved with holistic, comprehensive, integrated services and a housing-first approach. Miami-Dade County, where I live, is actually doing a pretty good job with serving people experiencing homelessness. It's the 4th largest county in the country, but the rates of homelessness are relatively low. And that's for at least 2 reasons I'll mention now, and we can get into it more later. The first reason is that in 1992, the county created the nation's first dedicated funding source for individuals experiencing homelessness. We have a 1% food and beverage tax, and 85% of that goes to homelessness services. And most of that goes to the Homeless Trust, which provides emergency shelter, a hotline, transitional housing, supportive services, disability services, permanent supportive housing, prevention and diversion programs. And the other reason, other than this tax, that Miami-Dade is doing well relative to other places in the country is that it takes a housing-first approach that prioritizes providing permanent housing to people experiencing homelessness quickly. And for those who don't know, a housing-first approach, and other folks on this panel can elaborate on it better than me, describes that a dwelling is not a reward for getting your life to a particular stage. It's a fundamental human right and the basis on which to build a successful life. So that's me.
Thank you, Asia. Yvonne?
Okay. It's my honor and privilege to be with you today and to provide some voice for people who often we don't know very much about, who don't have a voice. When I first started my work with homelessness, I was given a contract and sent to communities to study them, and the communities said, well, we don't have them, or they would say that, oh, you know, they're trash and they're the problem. And so what I have done over the past 20 years is really learned a lot to shatter myths. I have a book out on changing the paradigm on homelessness that I will be referring to today. And some of the things I would like to share with you is that homelessness is a preventable community and social problem, and that communities have seen that homelessness was coming for a long time. Back in the 1700s, Thomas Malthus predicted that poverty, misery, and despair would be the end result for the human race because it would be a natural exponential growth of the population to increase. And so we find now that communities lack available, affordable, accessible housing for the bulk of the people. And so what we're doing as a community isn't working. And part of this is looking at community planning, but part of it has, I think, us looking at history. And historically, just for a moment, we know that people were mobile, they were transient, they lived in tents, it was common. There was no negative stigma. But over time, as the industrial complex increased and people became rooted in communities for their jobs, we found that not everyone could get good enough jobs or have the situation, so they needed help. And charities came out, religious charities, social service type groups, and that they were helping people who were homeless and poor and hungry. But over time, there were so many people who needed that kind of help that the charities could no longer do it, so that they called upon the government to take upon the responsibility to provide for the community. And after a while, the government started to say, well, I don't know. And so they contracted out with social service agencies and to provide counseling, but they fragmented the services as we fragmented people. And ultimately, what we've seen develop is something called the shelter industrial complex, and that we have seen shelters pop up around the country as a solution. But it is a solution that is, in my opinion, ill-informed, because we saw this coming. And where was the community planning around making sure that we had available, accessible, affordable housing for everyone? What has resulted is a paradigm shift toward the criminalization of people who are without housing. And as I'm sure you'll hear today, there are lots of reasons for why people are without housing, and many of them have zero to do with being of their own fault. Yet we have criminalized them. We've now called upon businesses and philanthropies to come in and save us, and that they are not doing an adequate job, in my opinion. We have a lot of choice about how we're going to address homelessness, especially as it pertains to families, which are the largest population of homeless individuals today. We've got issues to look at. We've got sustainability issues. We have issues of poverty and economic distribution of equity and fairness. We're talking about taxation systems. We're talking about mortgage rates. We're talking about a lot of things that we could be doing differently that we are not yet. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to get the message. Certainly right now, we find it, excuse me, the Supreme Court, there's Johnson,
Johnson versus Grant Pass, which will be before the Supreme Court in just another.
That a girl. All right. And so it's addressing the Eighth Amendment. And so what we're finding is that either the courts are going to support the right of people to have dignity and respect for housing in encampments, or they're going to be criminalized. And when we look at Peter Edelman's book on its is it a crime to be poor? We're looking at the increased penalties that homeless people get hit with fees for being on the street, often for anywhere from $200 to $500 a night. And it doesn't take very long for that figure to increase. And if you can't pay it, which they can't, then they will be put in jail, which will give them a cost that they have to pay for, which they can't. And so what we're doing is not working, and we need to find a different way. I am advocating for a human rights and human dignity approach that we need to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. And Britta.
Good morning, and thanks to the university for having us, and thanks to all of you in this room who are here on a beautiful Colorado day to focus on this issue of homelessness and our lack of affordable housing. I want to bring to your mind David. David is 67 years old. He's a veteran. He's got a longer mop of gray and white hair and a little bit of kind twinkle in his eye. And David was randomized into our program at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless in March of 2023. That meant that our outreach workers went out and found him, and we got him into our bridge housing, which is a place for someone who has housing in the long term, but helps them get inside and get their documents and everything they need for a lease. And he came to us, and he had been on the street for in an experience of homelessness for about 20 years. And it had taken a toll. He was drinking heavily. He was at near daily trips with EMS to either detox or to ER. So he was in a hard living situation. David made it clear as he came into our program that he was grateful for the housing and also was not going to stop drinking. And he did not have that desire. However, once he was inside, once he got into his bridge housing and then into the apartment at one of our newest buildings at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, the Legacy Lofts, he was given support regularly, assertive offering of services where people came to him. And through that assertive offering of services, he then got an appointment and decided that he did want to reduce his drinking. And as he reduced his drinking further and got more healthcare services, he decided he wanted to do medication-assisted treatment as well. And so we could do all of that at our integrated healthcare model of housing and healthcare. Since David came to us now a year ago, as we sit here in April of 2024, David has not had a single ambulance trip in his time with us. He got benefits. He completed his 3rd cataract surgery in our eye clinic and now can see the world in new and amazing ways. When some saw David in his experience of homelessness on the street, they may have thought it was his choice or his trauma or his addiction, but most often people didn't see him at all. At CCH, we've been at the intersection of housing and healthcare for 40 years. We were started May 1st, 1984. We are here to help prevent collaboratively homelessness from occurring and also to create lasting solutions to homelessness. Because people like David need us to be there to offer an integrated health and housing approach. We know housing plus services works. We at CCH are part of the international base of evidence that shows that when we house people and we assertively offer services, they do remarkably well. We're seeing 80 to 90% success rates around the world. This pales in comparison to the treatment-first strategies that have been done for so long that have more of a 30% success rate. So why do we do this? We do it because it works. And on behalf of the nearly 900 employees of the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, including clinical care, housing care, child care, we say it is a human right for housing and for health care. That is what humans need. And so people like David are humans, and they are often unhoused by unjust and exclusionary systems that are designed to not house everyone. And so our care in our community, our respect, our seeing humans with worth, dignity, and value are what we can offer as a community. And when we do, life is better for David, and it's better for us all. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, guys. And so this is going to be more of a conversation amongst you, but I'd just like to start it with the general question. Again, I do policy here, and we often get the question, affordable housing is a need for sure in Boulder, in Denver, and Colorado, in the nation, growing to be a larger issue. But it acknowledges that correcting that is going to take time. And so there's often the conversation on what do we do right now? Do we invest in shelters? Do we invest in services for those on the street? What do you guys think is the best investment, knowing that there are limited resources? So if we spend it here, we can't then spend it there. And so oftentimes we go back and forth on, do we invest in a housing program with long-term solutions? But that's going to take time, so we know let's do something right now, knowing that it might not be the perfect solution. And to whomever wants to start.
I'll start. I work with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which all of the UN member countries have ratified, except for one country, which is the US. And they advocate that any decision that a community makes should first prioritize the best interest of the child. After all, children are the future of a community. They are also members of the communities, marginalized and unrepresented, to be sure. And so if we're talking about a community set of decisions on funding and how they're going to organize, then looking at what is good for children would be a good place to start, because it also means when you're taking care of children, you're taking care of families. When you are taking care of families, you're also taking care of employment in a community, as well as the government and social resources. So I think that instead of this top-down approach, working from the bottom up, looking at children would be a very useful place to start.
And children do best when they're in homes. So as someone who just oversaw one of the largest budgets in the state of Colorado for a city on housing and homelessness, I would say it's a lot of housing is where I would put my dollar. When we create with just a fraction of the cost of something that lasts for decades and can be a central home and stabilizing force, I put a lot of resources, most of the resources, into housing and supportive services that help people exit homelessness and from these very expensive interventions like detox, ER, those jail. That's one of the things that we proved with the supportive housing social impact bond was that we could save taxpayer dollars by investing it differently. And it's one of the reasons that the resources in Denver grew, was because they saw such savings. If we can prevent ourselves from having to build more jails by getting people to more humane solutions, all the better. It does not, however, mean we can stop doing everything else. And we can also improve shelter, which I think Asia will speak to here in just a little bit. But we do need to meet human crisis where it is occurring. And if we do not have the available housing stock, which one might argue we have it available, as there are tens of thousands of units vacant, but they are not available to the person who needs it. We have to help with human suffering where we see it. So I think it's all. There's always someone looking for a silver bullet or one tool. We need a lot of variety, but we should not give up most of our resources for a larger waiting room for what we know is the cure. And I see shelter and some of the non-housing focused programs as that ever-growing waiting room for housing, when we know that the cure and that care is really with housing and services.
can I just echo what Britta said? Housing, you'll find this interesting. Housing really is the reason that we have homelessness. A 2022 study found that differences in per capita homelessness across the U.S. were not due to differences in mental illness across cities and states, were not due to differences in drug addiction, were not due even to differences in poverty, but to differences in the cost of housing. West Coast cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, have homelessness rates 5 times what places like Detroit have, even though Detroit has higher burdens of opioid addiction and poverty. And there's no reason that that it should take a long time to develop affordable housing when it saves taxpayers money. It reduces the costs on society by half when chronically homeless individuals are housed. While we can't not pay attention to the trauma that homelessness causes and treating that, it's really the housing costs that are to blame for the differences in rates that we're seeing.
I would like to have a step and reiterate what everyone has said so far about housing being a human right. And so what is that? And so housing is written as a fundamental human right in both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child and a series of other human rights treaties. And so why was it included in there? And so we start to realize that housing is fundamental. If you don't have a stable, secure housing place, then you can't sleep. You have nowhere to cook. You have nowhere to store food. I worked with one family, and the new mom was keeping the milk for the baby in the toilet bowl because that was the only place that it was cool. I mean, what the lack of dignity that we put people into. We're talking about people having then the ability to be clean, to toilet, to be able to do their homework if you're a child, to be able to get ready for work the next day, to be able to do your laundry. We're talking about people who have a sense of community and their neighbors who can watch out for them. We're talking about being safe. We're talking about having control over who gets to come in and who doesn't get to come in to your residence. We're talking about having the ability to have a secure, ongoing place so that you can have a job that you can go to every day, that you have affordable daycare so that you can have your children safe. That we're talking about being able to get to school so your kids are well educated, and we're talking about having transportation systems that are available to all, as well as social media and Wi-Fi access. All of these are human rights treaties that are fundamental, and housing embodies all of them.
To put one last fine point on your question, Megan, if I was to advise Boulder or any other city in Colorado, I would say I would put as many rapid rehousing resources towards families. It's the fastest growing in Colorado right now, and shelter is not as appropriate as getting people right back to housing. And families show that they do very well when they get back into housing and can stay housed beyond that. So I would put your rapid rehousing resources there. I'd put as many into long-term supportive housing. The market does not produce housing that is affordable below 60% of area median income in Colorado. In Denver, it's been decades since a market rate unit at that affordability level has been produced without government subsidy. And so I would look at your policies for producing housing, your investments for the depth of affordability, and supports both on the shelter side as well as the home ownership side. But I have to say, one more point here, I would give as much direct income supports to people as possible, because it is cheaper, as we have found, to do things like the Denver Basic Income Program, where you're giving $12,000 to a person each year, sometimes $1,000 a month, sometimes $6,500 up front, and then $500 a month. That has had tremendous human outcomes, and people get housed, they get food, they spend less on intoxicating substances. When we give resource directly to people for their human needs, we don't have to create a complex. We they are able to be resourced in their own autonomy to find solutions to the problems that they're facing.
And just for some of you, if you don't realize, in the big picture nationally, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, and that Britta's overseeing, is regarded as one of the model programs in the country. So you're very lucky to have it and her.
Oh, thanks, Yvonne.
You guys touched on it a little bit already, but I often hear about Housing First and folks concerned about us putting folks in housing who may not be quote or unquote housing ready. Would anybody be able to speak to Housing First and why it was implemented as a national strategy?
Sure. I'll talk about two realities of it. One, the theory and the strategy and how it actually then works in real life. But the theory is that you don't have to be ready for housing. And there's also parallel theories around like employment. You don't have to be ready for employment. We have found those to be quite true. As the largest supportive housing provider in the state of Colorado, housing fits everyone. It does. Now, are there extreme cases where someone's psychiatric and healthcare needs are significant enough that they need some assistance and potentially a different setting? Yes, but there's so much focused in the conversation on such a small number of people versus the vast majority who just need access to some affordability and supports. I asked our staff this last year, how many people did they think of the 21,000 people that we saw that fit that category in their clinical care? That doctor said 2. So I'm just trying to put in perspective that, like, while there's a lot of talk about who should be in or out of housing, it's for everyone. Housing's for everyone. Are there sometimes difficulties? Are there floods or fires or other things? Sure. There are difficulties at different times, but that is a much more humane approach. And we have systems for handling those things. We don't have people, harmed in that setting. So it's really about, can we assertively offer services? Can we offer apartments to anyone? And the answer is yes.
This one is for you, Asia, specifically. Mm-hmm. Do you find operating in this arena, specifically in Florida with the politics there, to bring any challenges?
Oh. Yeah. Where do I begin? So DeSantis recently signed a bill preventing those that's our governor, from experiencing homelessness, from sleeping in public parks and sidewalks, and instead is allowing homeless camps and is not increasing money to counties to support these gatherings. So unfortunately, while Miami-Dade County is doing well with supporting individuals experiencing homelessness, Florida at large has some very outdated and punitive policies. There's 30,000 people experiencing homelessness in Florida. And, I'm an evidence-based person. I'm a social scientist, and all you really need to do is look at which cities, which countries are addressing homelessness well to know what the solution is. Finland is doing a great job, for example. They reduced homelessness from 20,000 people to less than 4,000 in a decade by providing people with small apartments and counseling with no preconditions. This is the solution. 4 out of 5 people who were given that opportunity made their way back into a stable life. The situation is not going to be solved by moving people experiencing homelessness into certain camps, which have horrible conditions. It's not going to be solved by criminalizing their day-to-day activities. It's going to be solved by providing shelter upon which they can build successful lives. I
have a couple questions that go along this line. There's been, primarily since COVID started, there's been some new intervention types where the safe outdoor spaces, so camping or tiny homes or single room occupancies, or in the larger cities, LA and now Denver, is doing it, moving folks by and large out of encampments and into hotels. Do you guys have any thoughts on whether that is a good strategy?
Well, I'm a little biased as the person who was at the city of Denver when all that occurred. I will say this. You heard me talk about the large budget and the approach. And so when we're building supportive housing and we are putting, very importantly, the vouchers into place that help us to operate supportive housing, we know that that is a pipeline, and I am proud that there's a much stronger pipeline today of those resources in Denver, and those take time to build. It is also not humane to allow people to languish on our streets without support either. And so when we look at what do we do for those who are not, that they have reasons for not accessing shelter, how do we make it more attractive? Both non-congregate sheltering and safe outdoor spaces have been interventions that get people to that next step, where then we're again able to offer assertive services, and then people get housed into better and better outcomes. And so I think you meet people where they're at. That's part of what we try to do. And so unauthorized encampments are not great for the person nor for our community. And so if we're able to get people into one step away from that, and then from there are able to house them, that is something. Now, I think personally, safe outdoor spaces should be a small slice of that bigger strategy, because again, the more we get people to homes or to home-like shelter, so the more that shelter is not just an overnight thing, but is a place where you have your own bed, you have your own storage, you have those stabilizing factors, that's better shelter. And so a lot of the non-congregate shelters been able to operate that way in motels as one example. So I think that's how we're pushing around. Again, I believe everybody's ready for the housing, but if the housing can't come fast enough, then yes, we have to do some other interventions. But that is not the best use of land or resource. In the long term, it could be a very good intervention while we're financing a future affordable housing site to utilize it in that way.
Another reason I think that the housing first kind of model is something wise to consider is that if you don't have a house, right, then you're not going to have, you're going to be transient, you're going to be moving around, right? And so you're going to not have the opportunity to have a stable job. You're going to not be able to have the kind of medical care for both physical and mental health and substance issues that would be desirable. We know that if you've got your own place, then you can make decisions. We know that a lot of the programs have loopholes, and if you don't check the right box, then you lose your benefits. And there have been cuts in the safety net that let people fall through. And part of it is we want to make sure that those holes are patched up. This is particularly true for unaccompanied youth because if you're 16, 17 years old and you're not under your parents' care, or you've got abuse and you've run away because things at home are so bad that you've decided it's better to live on the street than to face the dangers that are looming at home. So they can't legally be given services in many programs, and this has been a problem. I had a girl who was 16, she was pregnant, she had a new baby, her parents threw her out, and that she went to the shelter, and the shelter could keep the baby because the parent could sign the baby in, but they couldn't keep her because she wasn't of age. So sometimes there are rules that really make things very difficult. What if you are a parent of a teenage boy, that if you have your own home, then you can take care of that boy, but if you're in a shelter, sometimes because of sexual abuse rules that they don't want men in some of the shelters that would have families, then where's your son going to go? I mean, there are all kinds of things that are between the cracks, right? And so having your own place enables you to be empowered and make some good decisions and to spend your money wisely, as Britta has pointed out.
Have you guys seen a change in the population of individuals experiencing homelessness, meaning causes, or I think we've talked about recently the age of folks, the older adults becoming more prevalent on the streets and in shelters. Could anybody speak to that, or are homeless the same today as they were, 30 years ago?
I got my first direct service job here in Colorado, serving people experiencing homelessness and others who were food insecure 24 years ago. And at that time in Colorado, it was just a handful of a percent of people that were experiencing homelessness that were women. Today, that has changed dramatically. It's not one of the places I wanted gender equity, but it is one that we're getting closer to approaching. We're seeing, and I'm going to start with women and then toss it over to Asia because I know she can speak a little bit more on her research on that. I think throughout the time of people experiencing homelessness, there has been racial disparities that show our exclusionary housing system. That in Colorado, you're 4 times overrepresented if you are Black in experiences of homelessness. It's even higher for Indigenous populations, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So we have tremendous racial disparities because our housing systems have been exclusionary in the past. They have those remnants that stay. And while housing discrimination on the basis of race is illegal, it does not mean that it has ceased to happen. So we still see that, unfortunately, for who's most excluded from our housing systems. We here in Denver and in Colorado are also seeing an aging in who's experiencing homelessness. Those who are over 50 is, again, one of the fastest increasing demographics amongst those experiencing homelessness. And so, yes, we're seeing, unfortunately, more gender equity than we used to see. We're seeing persistent and stubborn disparities in the racial disparities of who's experiencing homelessness. And people are experiencing homelessness longer as we have not treated housing like something that is a human right or something that could save us other resources if we properly funded it. And so we are seeing people in longer chronic experiences of homelessness. And as a healthcare organization, I would be remiss in saying people are sicker because of it, and they are not living as long as they could. It is, when you look at national medical studies, and others can amplify this, is that you're seeing really a 20-year reduction in life expectancy from experiences of homelessness. That's pretty sobering.
I guess I'll add that when I started working with the women and families at Lotus House, one of the things that surprised me was really the incredible diversity of preconditions that led these individuals to lose housing. Illness, accident, sexual and domestic violence, eviction, falling into debt, medical debt. So, it really, we have so many stereotypes about what results in people experiencing homelessness. But really, it's all of these ways that housing is unaffordable. And to compound the issue of the racial discrimination that you were talking about, women of color in particular, make less money for the same work and have less familial wealth. And, maybe can't go to stay at mom's place because mom doesn't have a place. So, if we're going to reckon with homelessness in this country, we really need to reckon with our history of racial discrimination, housing discrimination. I'll just add that yes, we are seeing an increase in women experiencing homelessness, and that women do have unique needs, especially as relates to domestic and sexual violence. And it's interesting, one of the things that I asked the Lotus House CEO, president, founder, when we first started working together was, what percentage of women that you treat have trauma? And she said 100%. Homelessness is a trauma, right? If you didn't have trauma before, you have trauma now. There's a lot of reasons that people fall into this, housing costs being primary among them, but what leads you to be unable to maintain a dwelling is really variable, and it's not just drug addiction and mental illness.
And going back to what's good for children, we've seen, unfortunately, a growth in youth homelessness as well, and it's very disproportionate to LGBTQ plus identifying youth who have been, again, excluded from their homes and are more likely to be unsheltered, unaccompanied youth in our communities.
And picking up on that, we know that people really get hooked on numbers, right? Show me the data. And if there's a lot of numbers, then you feel like you have to do something about it. If there's not a lot of numbers, you say, well, there's not a problem. But the issue is that the way that we have traditionally counted homeless individuals has been skewed. And so there's something called the PIT count, or the point in time count, and they have one day where people go out and count. And if you're in a shelter, you get counted. If you're on the street, you'll get counted. But what if you're doubled up with your relatives who really would like you to go away? What if you are couch surfing, as a kid? What if you are not getting picked up? And so the numbers from the national data vary a lot, whether we're looking at the counts from HUD or if we're looking at the counts from the Department of Education. The Department of Education finds lots more kids are homeless or have difficulties with shelter, and they're not being picked up. And this is a real concern for communities. So I think there are more of them than we recognize.
What impact do you guys think universal basic income would have on this issue?
Well, I think I already mentioned it a little bit. So fundamentally, there are two categories of what causes homelessness in amongst myriad of stories. I see a change or disruption to one's income, or an unsustainable income, that like you're not paid enough to make rent, or your family breaks up in some way and now you have reduced income. And then that second reason being changes to a household. So relational breakup or fleeing violence or changes in kind of that primary relationship. Those are, in amongst the myriad of reasons and the individual stories, two of the biggest themes that we see in the self-reported data about what people indicate began their experience of homelessness. So when you think about that, and I think about this as somebody who has served in nonprofits, who's served in ministries, who's served in government, I see that our system design looks at aspects of a person instead of whole persons and whole households. And what I love about basic income is that it isn't there to be distributed through this particular department of government or that particular department of government and only to these people. Basic income resources human need. And if I could describe my career so far, it's figuring out how we best help to resource human need. And I am very, very encouraged by the studies out of Canada, out of here in the US, across the world that show when we resource human need without all of the bureaucratic restrictions and strings that we put on every dollar, and I'm very aware of those, both from the bureaucratic side and the administrating side in the community. When we give resource to humans, they meet their needs. They do. And it's pretty simple, it's pretty efficient, and it's incredibly effective. And if we know something can work that way, I'm having a harder and harder time to figure out why we shouldn't be doing it.
Oh, and picking up on that whole issue and looking at Finland and other communities, that outside of Seattle, they've had a problem, and so they hired a police officer to work on the street, but not to criminalize, but to get to know the people who are homeless. And they'd find that this one has a disability, this one has some cognitive problems, this one needs a job, this one had substance abuse, this one had some family problem. And they started working with the individuals as individuals and set each person up with the services that they individually need. And they're finding that something like 92% of the people that they've worked with don't go have homelessness again. There's no recidivism. And so they're able to stay into the community. So I think that this kind of model of investing in people with what they need really matters.
This question is kind of two-part. Homelessness is often seen as a local issue, regional issue, national issue. What do you guys think is the best way to go about addressing it? We often have the conversations, if we do this, but so-and-so is not doing that, then aren't we going to draw everybody here? So I guess, you know, without there is a national response, maybe not well-funded, but thoughts around that idea and not everyone coming to the table.
Okay, you have a bigger question, so we'll come back to that. I'm just going to take that little small part of the attraction of homelessness. When you look at the data, humans migrate, right? Right? We migrate. We kind of always have, if we look at ancient world history and whatnot. But it's only a portion of us that migrate, right? And go for different opportunity or water or land, or I come from the land of Minnesota and I wanted mountains. They're not in Minnesota. I came here. So that percentage of who is migrating or leaving a place to seek better opportunity is no different in the housed population than it is in the unhoused population. Just looking nationally at all the numbers, it's usually around like 10 to 12%.
Yep.
That's the same number amongst homelessness. So I just kind of want to tackle that one.
No, I'll just add to that. The number I saw was that about 80 to 90% of unhoused people are from the local area, right? Or they lived there for at least a year or longer.
Within
So
10
this is your
miles of where they
community.
last were housed.
Yes.
But I think that there's both the national as well as the local component. If the Supreme Court decides that homeless people should be criminalized, this is a national problem, and it will set a standard for every state and community to follow suit. On the other hand, we know that there are communities that are looking at the growth of the unhoused population, saying we don't have enough affordable housing. And so if they were able to create an area where, okay, this is where the tents are going to go up, and we're going to have porta potties, and we're going to have showers, and we're going to have a medical facility, and we're going to have a food pantry, and we're going to have cooking resources, and we're going to have places for people to put their trash. There are ways at a local level to keep encampments from being a problem where you have people, you know, on the street defecating or with hypodermic needles. You know, no community wants to have, you know, leftover food and rats and toxic things happening. It's a public health approach, and we could be doing a lot at a community level to deal with that.
I really like the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. It compellingly speaks to what Asia did before about housing cost. But homelessness is also a human problem. We as humans made systems that excluded people, or design systems that benefit those of us with land or with wealth, or systems of government that again benefit those of us with land or with wealth. We can change human systems too, because we're the humans in those systems. So I think it is, yes, a housing problem, but it's also a human problem, and that means it's every level of government. There's no level of government or community where it's not our problem. I think, though, Finland presents an excellent example of a roadmap. So for those of you who are not familiar with Finland, Finland has a population roughly the same as Colorado. It's just like within 100,000 people. So we're like a very similarly sized demographic of people. Finland I'm going to be pulling out a year, but I want to say it was 2012, declared in their constitution that housing is a human right. And they systemically worked to finance affordable housing and supportive housing, so housing with supports for people to exit homelessness who need that level of support. And what they've done is go from 20,000, as Asia said, to now just several thousand, so that their homelessness system actually works. Like shelters and that emergency intervention works better when it's not completely and utterly overwhelmed with humanity, which we have seen a lot of in Colorado, especially look at this last year and a half where we've had an influx of newcomers who are also without housing and supports. We have overwhelmed our emergency services. And so how they did it was they created a national lottery. So our Powerball or whatever, it goes toward not open space, it goes toward housing and services. And they also created a government financing thing, much like our tax credits in this country, and gave it some oomph that then helped finance more apartments. And then they had a large nonprofit, not unlike the one that I run, create supportive housing and affordable housing throughout the country and throughout the community. And guess where we put it? Where people have amenities. It is by transit, and it is by grocery stores, and it is by schools. And guess what? You can't tell. When you go to Finland today, there are not encampments all over the place. And that is where they started. They started with encampments in their parks and along their rivers and so forth, much like any of you in Colorado have seen. And they decided that's not humane. They made housing a human right. They resourced it. They funded it. And now people are in housing. It's more humane. It's very pleasant in their cities. It's very pleasant around the country because we're not seeing that human suffering that is occurring right in front of us. That is hard on all of our souls, and that has a cost. So I think Finland presents an excellent example of how you can make national policy and national investment and then have it supported at the local and local level. And that partnership is what's going to get us there. So it's all levels.
The Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization build upon Erickson's or Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what they're saying is at the bottom, the thing that everybody needs is to be safe. You need food, water, housing, and if you have that, then you can go on and have education and work and ultimately be self-actualized. But we're finding the data is really clear that if you don't have those resources, basic fundamentals of housing and food and safety, then you will have, as they've pointed out, a shorter lifespan, and they're tying it to all kinds of chronic diseases and substance problem and crime, so that from a cost-benefit analysis, it's really important to make sure that everybody has housing.
Mm-hmm. Knowing that there isn't one silver bullet, but now asking you kind of to tell us what that would be, what policy or single policy would you guys advise at both the national, state, and local levels to help address the root causes of homelessness?
I think I kind of gave a good example in the last answer. I think we need to say that, and this is actually, I'll give a national example. Opportunity Starts at Home is a national campaign that's supported by all sorts of human need organizations, nonprofits of all types that work with children, women, LGBTQ+, that work on health, that work on education, and so forth. And all these organizations are saying, opportunity starts at home, that we have to have housing, that we're not going to get the traction that we want in any of these human needs that we are desperately working to solve in our country and in our communities unless we address housing, because it all seems to come back to housing, which is how I myself got into housing. Was I was working on food insecurity, and it led me right to housing. I got to work on affordable housing if I care about people eating, because that's where it starts. So yes, I would say, along with all of those organizations, let's get affordable housing. Let's start with homes.
I'll just echo that we need to increase the inventory of available housing. Can you hear me? Here we go. And someone said, it takes a while to build new housing units. That's true, but in the meantime, you can provide rental assistance. You can provide grants and vouchers. You can reverse restrictive zoning policies, tax credits. There's so many ways to get people into housing right away that we can incentivize.
Joe Finn at the Massachusetts Coalition for the Housing has this model. He says, if you have lots of money and you have benefits, you do hunky-dory, right? And if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have benefits, life is miserable. And so if you have high income, you're probably not going to need too many benefits, right? So this would increase the importance of having good wage, right? Or if you don't have good wages, then you need more benefits, right? Then they can equalize out. So there's a relationship between then these two factors that I think a community needs to consider, of benefit and what we're paying people.
Sometimes when folks move into housing, they still experience the same issues around substance use and mental health, and now they are impacting their neighbors. Any thoughts on services that need to be provided once they are housed to help them maintain that housing and maybe not be as disruptive to the neighbors or their neighbors?
So SAMHSA says that about 50 million US adults have mental health issues. And SAMHSA also says more than 20 million US adults have self-identified substance misuse issues. Last I checked, there's like less than 1 million people experiencing homelessness. So we are able to house people with those issues every day, not only for those experiencing homelessness, but in general in our communities. Now, we have 23 properties at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and 2,000 apartments, and I also have, this is in the other duties as assigned, a 500-acre campus in Bent County in the Eastern Plains of Colorado, where we have a sewage treatment plant, a water treatment plant, and a water tower. And it is a lot to run all of those properties. But really what we're building are residential communities. And so the question's well taken, that like, how do we behave together as humans? What we found at the coalition, part of our secret sauce and our national model that works is, yes, we have a team that's looking at the asset or the property. We have a team that's looking at each individual person, the case management and so forth. But we also have a part that's called our residential services that looks at our community life. So how are we working together as a community? And that needs to be stewarded and fostered as well, because every human needs connection and community. And so how are we fostering that? So like anything else, there's no one size fits all, but you have to resource it. You have to help to come alongside someone who's having a hard time. And you'll see probably me or one of my spokespeople on the news occasionally, because some of those things are really hard. But I still think that staying housed and together is the best and most humane way.
The Centers for Disease Control says that 50% of the population has at some point a mental health diagnosis, a mental illness diagnosis. And that's only the people who get diagnosed, right? And so I think the chances of almost everybody having a mental health crisis at some point is pretty good to like be 100% of us, right? So with that, most of us don't end up homeless. Most of us keep our jobs. Most of us don't get into heavy drug use or crime, right? So the allegation or myth that homelessness is caused by mental illness, simply, I think you've really got to rethink that, because I don't think that that is correct. All right. I do think that people get trauma. We get all kinds of trauma, right, all the time. And so we need resources to help us. Some of us have good families that have support, or we're in a community where we have good insurance and we can actually access a provider. But we have a mental health crisis where there aren't enough providers, all right? I'm doing some work right now with schools, and I find that on average, there is one counselor in a school for every 250 students. All right, so we have many more police officers in schools per capita than we do counselors. And so if you're having a young person, you're in crisis, then where are you supposed to go, right? Especially you can't get insurance because you can't go ask a provider for help. So I think that part of this whole issue is to start shoring up our availability for mental health support, like what our colleagues are talking about. It's really important.
We've had local conversations around what we've termed high utilizers of systems, and Britta, you alluded to it in Denver as well with the social impact bond. Are there thoughts around how to fund services for folks who are utilizing the jail system, the criminal justice system, health system, mental health system, and just very much feel like they're in a spiral, a cycle, how to pay for services to serve those folks?
Thanks for that question. So the social impact bond for supportive housing that was done in Denver was started by my friend Reggie, who was working on actually the criminal justice side and seeing the revolving door of people through jails, and wanted to compare it against detox and ERs, and then against addresses from like shelters and those experiencing homelessness, the serving or without a fixed address. And when doing that, found that basically 200-ish people were costing the city and county of Denver about $7 million a year. And the natural reaction was, there's got to be a better way. And there is. And we proved it with a randomized control study that said, what would happen if we took people who had been arrested more than 8 times in the last 3 years, and who had been in and out of our detox and ERs and were experiencing homelessness, and we had a treatment group that said, okay, here's our control group. They're going to go through the regular, like trying to navigate the system on their own and try to find their way towards resources. And then for the other part of the group, we're going to get them right to housing, and then we're going to assertively offer services and see what that does. How does that work? A couple of things that were surprising in that study. One was that not all the people that were in those groups were known to service providers. There was a thought that they would be pretty well known to service providers, but many had been so far removed from services that they were really existing in these emergency services only. So we found all the folks, bridges, services, jails, whatnot. We got them to housing. Guess what happened to our humans? They did better. They did a lot better. They went to appointment-based care. They reduced nights in shelter. They reduced all sorts of clinical outcomes that are negative, and they saved taxpayer money by reducing days in jail, reducing shelter nights, and the human outcomes of their health and their well-being were really great. And so that is why we're all sitting up here saying that's the way to go, is housing plus services. It really does work, even for those who have been the most jailed and the most sick and used the most emergency services.
We are running up against time, so I want to thank the panelists and thank you guys all for coming and listening to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.